we have Sal from Ohio who wants to add thoughts on our abortion discussion. Sal, you are live on Truth Wanted.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. So yeah, I was just listening in, and I just figured I wanted to kind of weigh in on the abortion discussion, because I think that there's one argument that I don't hear enough of, and that is that, at least for me personally, and I think for many people, not all, but in my mind, it's more unethical to bring a life into the world that you yourself are not willing and able to care for.
I mean, how do you mean more unethical? What do you mean by that?
More unethical than terminating that potential life, in terms of, obviously it is life. It's a, non-conscious form of life, at least in the first trimester. I don't think you can make any argument that there's any consciousness there. And this is the other thing that I don't think a lot of people realize, that why the whole Roe versus Wade thing is a bit ridiculous, because how we had it with Roe versus Wade is first trimester, it was completely at the discretion of the woman, and second trimester, it was kind of more in the gray area of maybe state to state having different laws, and third trimester being like life. If I'm getting this wrong, if you guys know better, then correct me. But as far as I understand, life of the mother, serious health risks, would be the third trimester. And also just the fact that it was such a small percentage of, I think it's something like less than 1% or 1% of abortions were late term. So, I'm fairly certain that the vast majority of those are done for those reasons.
So neither of us are U.S. citizens, so we can't really comment on the legalities of the American system. But from my perspective as a physician, to me, an abortion is specifically like a termination of pregnancy, and how that occurs is sort of beside the point. It's, you can have an abortion that results in a non-viable fetus, a non-viable birth, or a viable birth, right? And so sometimes when you do it in sort of like the second half of pregnancy, an abortion can result in a sort of delivery and a viable birth. Whereas in the first trimester, or in the first, half of the pregnancy, our technology is not such that that would be a viable life. But the way that that we are taught to think about abortion is with the pregnant person's interest in mind, and we don't really consider the fetus. We don't really. So legally, they're not granted rights, right? In Canada or the U.S. Currently, at least. And so we don't really consider the air quotes rights or potential rights of that life, and so it doesn't really come into it for most physicians.
So my thought on that too is, because this reminds me of an argument that I saw recently. It was just an anonymous person making the argument that, hey, if we have the technology to, with incubators, to take a fetus out and bring that child into the world, and I'm assuming that in this case it would be put up for adoption. I am not saying that I don't consider anyone who makes that decision to be an unethical person. I'm not going to judge anyone who would make that decision. But for me personally, I would feel like I made an unethical choice if I myself am not willing to personally be the parent to this child that I'm bringing into the world, this human being, and to not have any guarantee that that human being is going to have a decent, loving upbringing that you're not taking responsibility for. I personally, I would feel much worse about that than,
yeah, I think that's reasonable, but like, yeah, obviously that's your choice, and some people may make another choice. I am curious about, maybe you're giving a child a better odds with the kind of decisions you'd have raising it, if you were to have that child, but there's no guarantee, obviously. If you were to be hit by a bus outside of the if you were to be hit by a bus outside of the, like outside the hospital, then you still wouldn't have that decision. They may have a better life, but I think to your earlier argument about would it be more ethical to, or you want to hear more of the argument that it might be more ethical to have an abortion at times if the person is unwilling to take care of that child. Was that something of what you were saying? I'm a little, I think that could be, sorry, what was that?
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that's just not brought up enough, and it's not, people don't, I just don't understand why, and like, look, don't get me wrong. I'm not attacking anyone who would decide to, put a child up for adoption. I don't want that to be, misunderstood.
Yeah, we get you.
I think what I struggle with that argument being used is, I think it could be a good bargaining chip if you're just having like general conversation, but I do think it kind of invokes the inverse argument of what is the potential life of this child, which a lot of people use to defend like an anti-choice viewpoint. What life could this child have? And that's the same argument you're kind of invoking with that. Like, they could have a bad life if this parent's not willing to have.
But you can't change your own personal. You can't change your own personal ability. Like, if you're in a place where you do not feel either able or willing to.
But is that an ethical situation? Like, so I think this is sort of like an ethical problem that results from poor policy and like us not taking care of people properly, right? Like if you, for example, lived in a society where all children it was ensured that they had a good provider, like someone who was going to be capable of providing for them financially and emotionally and all this stuff, even if it wasn't the parent, like if they could all, in a perfect world, they could all be adopted. I don't think that there's anything about the birth parent that is more, is better at delivering that, or like if the birth parent is delivering that, it's somehow better for the child.
I agree. And in a perfect world, and ideally with the adoption system, that it would be ensuring that, ideally all the kids would be matched up to loving families.
Right.
And I'm not even going to bring up anything socioeconomic. I'm just saying love, a loving family that wants to be a parent and wants a child. And
I mean, certainly I agree with you that if the alternative to abortion is being like a resented child in a home where you're unloved and financially unsupported, then it's a relatively easy, like for me at least, it would be a relatively easy decision, right? And I think that's sort of what you're driving at, right, Sal?
Right. And the other thing too is that, I mean, obviously we have problems with the adoption system. I mean, I don't know much about it, but part of my reasoning as to why I wouldn't feel right if I were to carry a child to term and birth that child, or even, let's say, I mean, I guess if you put it in the incubator, then that it detaches you in that sense, because there's a lot that happens between the mother and child bonding, right? But, or what have you, you know, whoever is birthing the child. But, but my point is that just not knowing if, hey, maybe this kid is going to end up in the foster care system for too long, you know, maybe they might get matched with a family that turns out to be abusive. I mean, I know that that's probably not a high percentage chance, but
it's riskier,
like
is sort of what you're saying.
Yeah, and like you say, anything can happen. You could get hit by a bus or whatever. But as far as the things that you can control, you can make the choice to bring a person into the world or not, you know, or, you know, to put the child up for adoption or not. And I think that those are both questions of that each individual should be free to make for themselves. I by no means want to take away anyone's right to either put their child up for adoption if that's what they feel is right, or to keep an unexpected pregnancy and become a parent and take on that responsibility, because that's a thing too.
So what you're saying is that you support them having a choice. You're pro-choice.
Yes, exactly. I respect other people for the choices that they make, but I just wish that there could be more acknowledgement to the fact that some people might be making what they feel is the more ethical decision by having an abortion.
Yep. I think that this goes back to like sort of what the previous calls were talking about, and that these two people are working from different frameworks, right? One, probably you might align closer with Vino and I in saying that we want to minimize the suffering of people. And so we think that an unwanted child who's forced upon a family might endure more suffering than, or might, you know, contribute more suffering to the universe than if they were, you know, if the
never to be fully
pregnant. Yeah, well, exactly. Like if the pregnant person had an abortion, right? Whereas the other person, maybe the Christian, sees an inherent value to the life, and so they are trying to value that life. So that's where I think a lot of our disagreements between the pro-choice and the anti-choice movement are concerned. A lot of that comes from a fundamental disagreement about what our ultimate goal is. At least that's my take on it. What do you think, Vino?
Well,
sorry. Yeah. I think it's. I think you're right about that. I am curious about this argument from from before, with the saying, "Oh, it's going to cause more suffering to have the child than not." It doesn't give me a lot of. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence to use that argument, but because I do think it invokes something that's unknowable in general. Like it doesn't have any bearing on whether the morality of the procedure, right? Like you were saying, MD, the procedure is sort of separate. If we're trying to look at the total net effects, I think that's more of a policy decision, but I don't know who that argument is for, because the person who's going to get the abortion is going to get the abortion anyway. And the person who's against it and would be more likely to have to carry that child to term would be morally against in general, right?
And I know you guys are both Canadians,
afraid so.
I would say the argument that the person who would get the abortion is going to get it anyway, that may be true, but then it's also like it may not be true if it's made unavailable to them.
So if they don't have the choice, how could they possibly do it? Right?
How could they choose? Yeah, for sure.
Unless they want to risk something dangerous to themselves.
Right.
And so then you're essentially holding people hostage to, just because they had sex. And of course, birth control is great. Birth control you should use, but birth control fails.
Yep.
And that's also being made to be less accessible for a lot of people. So, I just wanted to also add on to the concept of the inherent value of life. And to me, I mean, I know I'm not, and when it comes to the monetary stuff, I really, cringe at that, and I would rather just leave that to the people who have to make those decisions for practical purposes only, and not have to think about it outside of that.
Right.
But to me, the inherent value comes down to consciousness and that own individuals of self and self-worth and love too. Like, it's not, you can't boil it down to one thing, but it's, I think, a degree of consciousness, a degree of self-worth, a degree of, feeling loved.
So like,
I mean,
in fear of splitting semantic hairs again, I think that the inherent value is it's not inherent value. It's value that you're attributing it to because you also have consciousness, right? It's not a matter of inherent, like you can't bottle that value up. It's not that's not a bad thing. It's just a matter of the semantics for our friend earlier.
I mean, it's probably coming from a place of empathy, right? It's like, what it is to suffer and lose something that you care about. And so you don't want yourself or anyone else to have to endure the same thing that you have.
Yeah, and it's also like, from my subjective point of view, if I imagine life existing on some other planet that doesn't have any sense of self-awareness or empathy or love in any way, they're just like automatons, but they're alive technically, then that's why I say maybe it's not life, it's more like level of consciousness and just everything that kind of goes with that. Like when you have a sense of self, which arguably a baby doesn't have until they're, at least at the time that they're, I don't really know because I don't know enough about psychology, but it's
probably later than you're comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I personally hate to think about third term abortions. I really do. I think that would be really difficult.
Again, many third trimester abortions are not like, they don't necessarily result in the death of the fetus, right? They don't result in a non-viable product of conception, we would say. A lot of them are, a person decides they don't want to be pregnant anymore, but most of them are because there's something like the fetus has died, right? And so they need to, the abortion or the termination of pregnancy needs to occur for the safety of the pregnant person. And so we often don't even have to worry about the ethics of that dead product of conception, non-viable fetus.
How euphemistic can you get with the term?
That's the technical term.
Yeah, I bet. Sal, I have one more question for you though. Does a hole exist?
I wanted to just add that, to wrap things up, it just comes down to, it's a really hard decision to make.
Yeah.
And there's so many variables that go into the ethics of it. And I just think that the best person to make that decision is the person who's pregnant. So
we are on board with you, Sal. You'll have no arguments from us.
All right. Well, thanks for taking my call.
Thanks very much for calling, Sal.